Welcome, champions of African Renaissance. Today we're diving deep into one of the most significant geopolitical transformations of our time, the African Resource Revolt. This isn't just another political analysis. This is the story of a continent awakening to its own power, reclaiming its destiny, and fundamentally reshaping the global economic order. From the gold mines of Ghana to the uranium deposits of Niger, from the cobalt reserves of the Democratic Republic of Congo to the oil fields of Chad, African nations are finally saying what should have been said decades ago: our resources, our terms. And at the forefront of this revolution stands a new generation of African leaders who refuse to bow to the puppeteers of neocolonialism. But before we explore this continental awakening, let's establish the historical context that makes this moment so extraordinary. For over 5 centuries, Africa has been systematically plundered. First, through the horrific transatlantic slave trade that robbed the continent of its most precious resource, its people. Then through colonial occupation that carved up territories with no regard for indigenous boundaries or governance systems. And finally, through the more insidious neocolonial structures that emerged after formal independence, designed to maintain economic dependency while providing the illusion of sovereignty. The numbers are staggering and should ignite righteous anger in every African heart. According to research by economist Alliance Ndikumana, Africa loses approximately $68 billion annually through illicit financial flows. That's more than the continent receives in foreign aid and foreign direct investment combined. Meanwhile, African countries pay more in debt servicing to Western creditors than they spend on healthcare and education for their own people. This is not incompetence. This is a deliberate system of extraction designed to keep Africa as a supplier of raw materials and a consumer of finished goods. The resource curse, as economists euphemistically call it, has been Africa's burden for generations. Nations blessed with abundant natural wealth somehow remained among the poorest on earth. But here's what the mainstream narrative deliberately obscures. This wasn't inevitable. It wasn't some inherent African failing or the result of cultural deficiencies. It was the product of systematic exploitation, enabled by compliant leaders who served foreign interests rather than their own people. Enter the new generation. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso represent a fundamental shift in African political consciousness. When Traoré speaks about sovereignty, he's not engaging in empty rhetoric or populist posturing. He's articulating a comprehensive vision for African self-determination rooted in practical economic policy and genuine Pan-African solidarity. His administration has already demonstrated remarkable courage in confronting the French colonial apparatus that has strangled Burkina Faso's development for decades. The expulsion of French troops from Burkina Faso wasn't just a military decision, it was an economic declaration of independence. For too long, the French military presence served primarily to protect French corporate interests in African mining and agriculture. When African leaders finally said, enough, they weren't being reckless or anti-Western, they were being strategically brilliant. Consider the broader regional context. The Alliance of Sahel States comprising Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger represents something unprecedented in modern African politics, a coordinated rejection of neocolonial structures backed by concrete alternative policies. These nations haven't simply criticized the old system, they've begun building new frameworks for economic cooperation, resource management, and regional security. The media response to these developments has been predictably hysterical. Western outlets immediately reach for the familiar playbook, dismiss African agency by labeling every sovereign decision as Russian influence or Chinese manipulation. This narrative is not just intellectually dishonest, it's profoundly racist in its assumption that African leaders cannot think strategically for themselves or that African people cannot judge what serves their interests. Let's examine the economic fundamentals driving this transformation. Africa possesses approximately 30% of the world's mineral reserves, including 60% of global cobalt, 90% of platinum group metals, and substantial deposits of gold, diamonds, uranium, and rare earth elements. Yet African countries typically export these materials as raw commodities, receiving a tiny fraction of their final market value while importing expensive finished goods. This colonial economic model has persisted through instruments like the CFA franc, which remains one of the most sophisticated mechanisms of financial control ever devised. 14 African countries are still compelled to deposit their foreign reserves in the French treasury, effectively giving France veto power over their monetary policy. When leaders like Ibrahim Traoré question this arrangement, they're not being radical, they're being rational. The youth perspective on these changes is particularly illuminating. Africa has the youngest population in the world, with over 60% of Africans under the age of 25. This generation has grown up with global connectivity, witnessing how other formerly colonized nations like South Korea, Singapore, and Vietnam transformed themselves through strategic economic planning and technological advancement. They see no reason why Africa should remain perpetually dependent on former colonial powers. These young Africans understand something their elders were often forced to suppress, that genuine development requires control over your own resources, your own currency, and your own economic destiny. They're not interested in aid dependency or charitable relationships with former colonizers. They want trade partnerships based on mutual respect and shared benefit. The technological dimension of this resource revolt cannot be overlooked. African nations are increasingly leveraging digital platforms, blockchain technology, and direct bilateral relationships to circumvent traditional Western-controlled financial systems. When Burkina Faso begins accepting payment for gold in local currency or Chinese yuan, it's not just diversifying its trading relationships. It's fundamentally challenging the dollar-based system that has facilitated decades of wealth extraction. Regional cooperation is emerging as a cornerstone of this new approach. The African Continental Free Trade Area, despite its imperfections, represents the largest free trade zone by country participation since the formation of the World Trade Organization. When African leaders prioritize intra-African trade over traditional North-South relationships, they're creating the foundation for genuine economic independence. The Democratic Republic of Congo provides another compelling case study. Despite possessing mineral wealth worth an estimated $24 trillion, the Congolese people remain among the poorest on Earth. For decades, this contradiction was maintained through corrupt proxy leaders who enabled foreign extraction while providing minimal benefit to their population. The recent shift toward more assertive resource nationalism in Congo represents millions of people finally demanding their fair share of their own wealth. Similarly, Ghana's decision to negotiate gold purchases in local currency rather than dollars reflects a broader understanding that monetary sovereignty is inseparable from political sovereignty. These aren't random policy decisions. They're components of a comprehensive strategy to break free from the structural adjustment programs and debt dependency that have characterized African economies since the 1980s. The energy sector presents perhaps the most dramatic opportunities for transformation. Africa possesses enormous potential for renewable energy development, particularly solar and wind power. Rather than simply exporting fossil fuels to fund imports of expensive refined products, forward-thinking African leaders are investing in domestic refining capacity, renewable energy infrastructure, and value-added manufacturing. Nigeria's Dangote refinery, despite the obstacles it has faced, represents this new thinking in action. When African entrepreneurs build facilities that process African resources for African consumption, they're not just creating jobs, they're breaking the fundamental logic of colonial economics. The agricultural dimension of resource sovereignty is equally crucial. Africa imports over $35 billion worth of food annually, despite having 60% of the world's arable land. This absurd contradiction exists because colonial agricultural systems prioritized cash crops for export over food security for local populations. Leaders who prioritize food sovereignty and agricultural self-sufficiency are making strategic decisions that will benefit their people for generations. Pan-African coordination is essential for this transformation to succeed. Individual African nations, regardless of their resource endowments, remain vulnerable to external pressure when acting alone, but coordinated African action changes the entire dynamic. When multiple nations simultaneously assert control over their resources and align their policies, they create leverage that no individual country could achieve independently. The financial architecture supporting this transformation is evolving rapidly. African Development Bank initiatives, bilateral trade agreements denominated in local currencies, and resource-backed lending arrangements are creating alternatives to the traditional Western-dominated financial system. These aren't temporary expedients. They're the building blocks of a multipolar economic order where Africa commands the respect its resources and human capital deserve. Critical to this analysis is distinguishing between leaders who genuinely serve African interests and those who merely exploit anti-Western sentiment for personal gain. Authentic African leadership demonstrates itself through concrete improvements in living standards, transparent governance, and policies that actually strengthen rather than weaken national institutions. The African people themselves are the ultimate judges of which leaders deserve their support. The media coverage of these developments reveals the profound anxiety that African agency creates in certain circles. When African leaders make sovereign decisions about their resources, Western outlets immediately frame these choices as threats to global stability or democratic governance. This framing deliberately obscures the reality that the current system of resource extraction is itself profoundly undemocratic and destabilizing for African populations. The generational shift in African leadership cannot be overstated. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré represent Africans who came of age in an era of global connectivity and technological advancement. They're not impressed by former colonial powers or intimidated by threats of isolation. They understand that Africa's time has come, and they're positioning their nations to benefit from that historical moment. Youth engagement in these sovereignty movements reflects a sophisticated understanding of global economics and geopolitics. Young Africans see how resource-rich nations like Norway, Qatar, and Botswana have leveraged their natural wealth to create prosperity for their citizens. They reject the narrative that Africa is somehow different or that Africans should accept permanent poverty despite sitting on vast mineral wealth. The technological revolution provides African nations with unprecedented opportunities to leapfrog traditional development models. Mobile banking, digital governance systems, and renewable energy technologies allow African countries to build modern economies without replicating the resource-intensive development paths of earlier industrialized nations. Regional security cooperation is emerging as another crucial component of economic sovereignty. The Alliance of Sahel States joint security arrangements represent African solutions to African challenges, reducing dependence on foreign military interventions that often serve external rather than local interests. The monetary dimension of sovereignty deserves special attention. Currency is power, and the movement toward local currency trading, regional monetary unions, and alternatives to dollar-denominated transactions represents a fundamental challenge to the existing global financial order. When African nations trade their resources for Chinese yuan, Indian rupees, or other non-Western currencies, they're not just diversifying their economic relationships. They're asserting their right to choose their own trading partners and monetary arrangements. This resource revolution is not just about economics. It's about dignity, respect, and the fundamental right of African people to control their own destiny. For too long, Africa has been treated as a junior partner in global affairs, despite possessing the resources and human capital that power much of the world economy. That era is ending, and the transformation is irreversible. The success of these sovereignty movements will ultimately be measured by their impact on ordinary African lives. Rhetoric without results is meaningless, but when resource nationalism translates into better schools, improved healthcare, reliable electricity, and economic opportunities for young people, it demonstrates the transformative potential of authentic African leadership. As we witness this continental awakening, it's crucial to understand that we're not just observing political changes, we're witnessing the birth of a new global order where Africa claims its rightful place as an equal partner rather than a subordinate supplier of raw materials. The African Resource Revolt is more than a political movement. It's a declaration that the era of taking African wealth while leaving African people in poverty is over. It's a statement that African leaders will serve African interests, that African resources will benefit African people, and that the continent's vast potential will finally be unleashed for the benefit of its own citizens. This is just the beginning. The transformation we're witnessing today will reshape global politics and economic economics for generations to come. Africa is rising, not as a supplicant or dependent, but as a confident, self-determined force that will claim its place among the world's most prosperous and influential regions. If this analysis resonates with you, if you believe in African sovereignty and the right of African people to control their own resources and destiny, then hit that like button to support this message. Subscribe to this channel to stay informed about these crucial developments that mainstream media either ignores or deliberately misrepresents. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our coverage of Africa's continuing rise. Share this video with everyone who needs to understand that Africa's time has come. Your engagement isn't just supporting a YouTube channel, it's supporting the movement for African sovereignty and self-determination. Together, we're building the narrative that celebrates African agency, wisdom, and the unstoppable march toward continental prosperity and independence. The revolution is here. The question is not whether Africa will reclaim its resources and its destiny. The question is how quickly that transformation will accelerate. Stay tuned, stay informed, and stay proud of this magnificent continent as it finally claims its rightful place in the world.